Happy New Now, all you positive heads out there. It's so good to be back with you as always. If you're new to this podcast, of course, we are super happy to have you here, and we just ask that you bring an open mind and heart to your listening experience and to be prepared to explore vantage points that I'm convinced will help shift or solidify your current understanding of the ultimate nature of reality. While listening, you'll be exposed to inspiring, empowering, and unifying perspectives that I'm highly confident will yield stellar results in your life if you opt to try them on for size. Also, I'm super happy to announce that we have officially launched our new late-night style, consciousness-elevating video variety talk show, Optimistic, which features live visionary artists, soul share interviews, retreat guests that come here to the Mystic Manor to join me and the interviewee on the stage during the last night of their stay, their week-long stay, as well as the show concluding with live musical performances. We're going to be releasing episodes every other Sunday at 11:11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, and you can go to optimistic.tv, that's spelled OPTIMYSTIC.tv, to join our watch party for each future episode's release or to check out past episodes. We were originally going to be releasing Optimistic episodes every Sunday. However, as a community, following the flow of what is wanting to come through in these unique and unprecedented times with so many of our soul family stuck at home, craving connection, we have decided to move to releasing episodes every other Sunday so that those of us here on the production team at the Mystic Manor can free up some time and energy to help create virtual community for all of you P-heads out there. And we are accomplishing that aim by launching our new Mystic Manor online retreat and play shops re-membership program. It's going to entail live play shops twice daily, 7 days a week, behind the scenes footage here at the Mystic Manor each day, access to a Facebook group where we do short interactive 1-minute video challenges and reflect back to each other about our experiences, live Q&As with me and some of the other facilitators, and more. It's a super robust program. It's facilitated by over a dozen of us here at the Mystic Manor, and in an effort to support all you P-heads out there stuck at home craving connection, for a limited time, it is going to be totally free to sign up on our Patreon page, which is linked at optimistic.tv. Just be sure to fill out the form link that's located at the top of our About section on Patreon so we can make sure you have access. Otherwise, we're super excited to have you join in all the magic with us that's happening here every single day at the Mystic Manor and to expand our community together. Here we grow. All right, all you positive heads, on this week's Soul Share interview, I'm very excited to have Mike Robbins here with me on the show. Mike is a former pro baseball player and motivational speaker who has helped motivate employees at some of the world's biggest companies such as Google, Microsoft, and eBay. He has also authored 5 books, with his latest book about to come out, which is titled We're All in This Together. He's also been featured in some of the world's biggest publications, including acting as a regular contributor to Forbes. Hello there, Mike. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hey, Brandon. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Looking forward to this. This is a very pertinent topic for me at this time, dealing with a team. Big time with the launch of my new show, Optimistic, and I'm really excited to get some insight and wisdom and pointers from you on how I can be a better leader, and of course there's so many overlapping perspectives to share when you come to the, you look at this idea of us all being in this together, whether it's with a company, whether it's with your family, whether it's with the planet coming together right now. And with the pandemic that, as we're recording this, is currently everyone's on lockdown, with coronavirus. So, before we go deep down the rabbit hole here, I'd like to start with the same question I always start with. And that is this. You're in an elevator. The woman next to you looks over, says, "What's your passion?" You have 10 floors to answer. What do you say?
My passion is connecting with people authentically and continuing to try to expand my capacity for love and compassion and understanding.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I love that. Well, let's, if you would give a little insight into your backstory. It sounds like you've had quite the interesting journey. Whatever feels relevant to share about your backstory.
Yeah, well, like most of us, I've got a journey that I've been on for, I'm 46 years old now. So, but I basically, I live up here in the Bay Area. I know you're down in Southern California. I grew up here.
Yep.
I played baseball all growing up as a kid and was really into it, was pretty good at it. Actually got drafted out of high school by the New York Yankees.
Wow.
I
Right out of
didn't
high
end up
school.
right out of high school. I didn't actually end up signing with the Yankees at that time because I got an opportunity to play baseball in college at Stanford.
Wow.
So I went to Stanford, which was a lifelong dream of mine to play baseball at Stanford, and got a chance to play there and get an education. Ended up getting drafted again out of Stanford by the Kansas City Royals, and I signed a pro contract. And, the way it
Cool.
works in baseball is most people listening know you sign a contract with a major league team, whether it's the Yankees or the Royals or the Dodgers or any of the teams in the major leagues, right? You have to go into the minor leagues, and there's a bunch of levels of the minor leagues. You got to work your way up to get to the major leagues. I went into the minors. I was a pitcher, doing pretty well, working my way up. Unfortunately for me, Brandon, my third season, still in the minors, I went out to pitch one night. I threw one pitch. I tore ligaments in my elbow,
What?
blew my
One
arm out.
pitch?
One pitch, and
What?
that was it. I know. I
Oh,
was 23 at the time when I got hurt. I had started playing when I was 7.
wow.
I ended up having 3 surgeries over the next 2 years. Tried to come back, wasn't able to make it back, and on my 25th birthday, retired from baseball.
Wow.
So it was, it was, as you can imagine, it was devastating, right? I
Oh,
mean, this
I
had
can
been,
imagine.
but personally, it was obviously a humongous blow to my ego and my identity. I mean, this had been my thing. I was Mike the baseball player, and so it was a real the stretch of time from my in my early 20s, even before I got hurt, quite frankly, I struggled with some mental illness and really kind of went through what I would now look back at and say was sort of a dark night of the soul for me for a number of
Sure.
years. And I think in some ways it was internal conflict that I was having. I loved baseball and I loved playing. I really loved the team and I loved the competition and the challenge of it. There were parts of it that I didn't love and I didn't totally understand, and the pressure of it was kind of hard. And so there were things going on emotionally and even spiritually for me that I wasn't totally aware of. And so the getting hurt was devastating, again, to my ego, to my identity. But there was kind of this secret part deep in me that I didn't even realize until later that was actually kind of excited. Like, oh, well, now the whole world opens up because I don't have to be a baseball player anymore.
Sure.
But that was also terrifying because it was like, well, what the hell
Oh,
am I
you
going to
knew.
do?
Yeah.
Right. And this was my thing. I mean, and this was what I thought made me unique or made me special or made me interesting or whatever. And
Yep.
so, it ended up being that what I turned to, I came home, it was the late 90s. I needed to get a job to like pay the rent because I hadn't made much money playing baseball. I was still in the minor leagues where you don't make much money at all and didn't come from a family with any money. So I get a job in San Francisco working for an internet company that I wasn't all that interested in, but got really interested in personal growth from my own perspective, spiritual growth, like wanting to try to understand and heal myself. What is going on? I have all of this, not just this injury and this huge life transition, but like I had spent most of my life, like I think a lot of us do in our American culture, especially like trying to be good at something or good at things, school, sports, whatever, have people like me. And then sort of that's how you win the game of life. Right.
Right.
And I felt like I was spending all this time trying to quote unquote win, but I was losing and I didn't understand why. Why did I feel so empty? Why did I feel so alone and so confused? And again, I could then understand, or looking back now, realize, oh, a lot of people feel that way, not just at that age, but in general. But especially 20, 25 years ago, at least for me as a young man, people weren't talking about that in my circles. I didn't know that that was sort of a common experience that a lot of human beings had. But I started to really go down the path of wanting to understand more deeply myself, because what I'd also been interested in as an athlete was I noticed that it wasn't always the most talented people that were the most successful, and it wasn't always the most successful, and I say that sort of in air quotes, that were the happiest and most fulfilled.
Sure.
And I wanted to try to understand that whole dynamic. And then on a team level, I was also fascinated by team dynamics because I was on some teams that had really good talent. And you figure in sports, like if you have the best players, you should have the best team. that wasn't always the case. In fact, it often wasn't the case. I was on some other teams where, the talent was decent, but the team dynamic, the team chemistry, as we'd call it in sports, was really strong. We cared about each other. We rooted for each other. The egos didn't get completely in the way, and like something magical would happen, and the team would really perform. And it was this like, whoa, I'm fascinated by that. And when I got into the tech world, the .com world, even though I wasn't super interested necessarily in what I was doing, I was like, oh, that same dynamic of not the most talented people are the most successful and not the most successful are the happiest exists here and everywhere. And that thing about team chemistry, that's not a sports thing, that's a human thing. So based on all of that and my interest at the time, I started my business almost 20 years ago, really wanting to write, wanting to speak, wanting to coach, wanting to help people along their journey. Not really sure, quite frankly, Brandon, in those days, how I was going to do that. I was 26, 27 years old, how I would make a living doing that. I just knew I was drawn in the direction of wanting to teach and wanting to inspire. And it's evolved quite a bit over the last 20 years. A lot of what I do and a lot of what my books or most recent books are about is these big companies bring me in to talk about, teamwork and collaboration and how we build strong relationships. And so I've sort of created a whole body of work around that. And at the end of the day, I'm so grateful for all these companies that I get to partner with and my team gets to partner with. And my passion has never really been business for the sake of business. I mean, I think Google's a great company. I think, eBay's a wonderful place. I mean, I'm more interested in the human beings there.
Sure.
And it really just happens to be that for whatever reason, I've sort of carved out this niche where businesses and business leaders and companies like me to come in and talk to them about things in a way that seems accessible and makes sense. And people can translate that into personal and group success and fulfillment.
Yeah, what's interesting about what you're saying is, and I've had a journey as a serial entrepreneur my whole life, from having times where it's, me very solo to, I had a company at one point a few years back where it had grown from me to 100 plus employees.
Oh, wow.
And learning how to navigate. Oh, hold on. Brandon, you're kind of this rogue character who maybe isn't always the best leader you could be, and how, and learning about team culture and all of those things. And quite frankly, it's something that I still have a lot of room to grow. So, I'm curious. I'd love to kind of explore what it is, that you share in your books. And, of course, your newest book that's just about to come out, We're All in This Together. It's all about creating a team culture of high performance, trust, belonging. And curious what some of, obviously reading the book when it comes out is going to go really deep dive, but maybe you can highlight some of the core themes and pillars and overview for us.
So I wrote this book actually for a couple of reasons, Brandon, and there's a new reason or significance, I think, of the book that's interesting before I kind of dive into the four pillars. I wrote it because, I've been focused on teamwork and team culture for a number of years in my work. And the last book that I wrote, my fourth book, Bring Your Whole Self to Work, came out a couple of years ago. And the fifth principle of that book is called Create a Championship Team. Basically, it's something I talk a lot about from my sports background. And a championship team doesn't mean you win all the time and you're perfect. It means you really focus on the health of the team, the culture of the team, like nurturing the team. And I decided after writing that principle in that book, I wanted to sort of double click on that topic and go even deeper and do some new research related to the work I've been doing for a number of years with teams, but really look at what does it take in today's world, today's environment, to really create that kind of culture where people can thrive. And the second reason that I wanted the book to come out in 2020, and I wrote it, I've written 5 books, but over the span of about 13 years, I don't actually love to write. It's a challenge. It takes a lot of time for me. My wife and my daughters are not always the happiest with me when I'm going away to write. And anyway, but I felt compelled, like I have to write this book and I have to write it now. And the reason was wanting it to come out in 2020, calling it We're All in This Together, which is related to teamwork, but also in terms of what's happening in our country here in the United States and in our world with all of the intense divisiveness.
Right.
I really felt like I wanted to make a statement and share. The book's not political per se, but it's really about how do we get past the us versus them mindset and more into it's really all us. There's no them. And so that's kind of infused into the book. Now, I had no idea, of course, that the book was going to come out in the midst of a global pandemic that none of us expected or saw coming, except for maybe some epidemiologists or, public health experts who study these kinds of things. And what's interesting is the book is coming out, and this phrase, "we're all in this together," is literally being said by politicians and leaders and celebrities and people. And it's a hashtag. And it's like this, I didn't write this book about that per se,
Sure.
but at the same time, and you and I were talking about this before we hit record on the podcast, like this notion of all of us being in it together there's a lot of depth to that goes even beyond simply just how do you get a team or a family or a group of people to sort of get on the same page. There really is this sense of how are we all connected as human beings on the planet. And what's weird is, we're facing something right now that none of us have ever faced before. And as scary as it is and as challenging as it is, there is something, and I don't mean to sugarcoat it, but there's something really beautiful to me in the solidarity of it.
For sure.
I'm sitting here in my office, in my house, you're in your office, in your house, everyone listening to us right now, if they're listening, unless you're listening 6 months or a year or 5 years from now, you're somewhere sort of in place, sheltered in place, or whatever we're calling it. And we're all sort of separated and disconnected, but we're all together at the same time. And in a way, it's a larger, more intense metaphor for teams and groups are made up of individuals. And in our American culture, especially, there's a lot of individualism that we're proud of. And there's, I'm my own unique self, and I'm going to speak my truth, and I'm going to do my thing, and I'm going to express myself creatively and spiritually. And that's a beautiful thing. And the paradox is we can do all of that and simultaneously really commit to and surrender to and almost sacrifice for, and I mean all of those things in the best senses of those words, to something greater than us.
Right.
And any of us in life, whether it's a sports team or a family or a community team or a church group or a business team, we've all had experiences. Maybe they're few and far between where we've been a part of a group where it's like, oh my goodness, I love doing this with these people because it was magical. Something great got created collectively, but also something great came out of me that I didn't even know was there because I was with this group of people doing this thing.
Right.
And that was the thing for me all those years playing baseball. It only happened a handful of times, but when it did, when I was on a team where it's like, wow, these guys are really rooting for me and I'm rooting for them, and we've done something together that somehow or another we got past our egos and our little competitiveness and our jealousy and all that stuff. Not that it went away completely because we're human beings, but we got sort of plugged into something larger. And that's kind of the context of the book, if you will, and a lot of my work. And the pillars kind of go into different aspects of things that I've studied and learned about human behavior and human beings and what it takes. And the first pillar is to create psychological safety. And psychological safety is basically group trust. It means the group, the team, has a sense of trust as a group. It's actually less about the individuals on the group and more about the dynamic that we create, the sort of context we create as a group. What that means is if you're part of a group that has psychological safety, again, think about a family, think about a team of any size or any kind. What's available for the members of that group is you can speak up, you can disagree, you can make a mistake, you can take a risk and fall flat on your face, you can dissent from the group, and no, all of those things can happen. And I'm not going to be kicked out of the group. I'm not going to be shamed, ridiculed, right? Somehow there's not going to be some negative retribution. Now, there might be consequence, there might be accountability, all those things. But again, when a group has psychological safety, it means people feel safe to be themselves, to speak up, to really kind of go for it. And the thing that we now know, and there's a ton of research behind this. Google did a study a few years back called Project Aristotle. They spent 3 years studying this, Brandon. They brought in all these scientists and all these researchers and all these really smart people. They did a bunch of internal research and study and within Google, but then they sort of pulled back and said, what's going on in the larger tech world? What's going on in the larger business world right now? What's going on in terms of performance? They were trying to solve for what do teams need in order to thrive? Because like every company on the planet, and Google does a really good job of hiring really smart, talented people, but they have some teams that do great and really perform well. They have other teams that do okay. And they have a lot of teams, just like every company, that struggle and sort of can't get out of their own way.
Yeah.
So they were trying to figure out, what do we need to do to equip our teams and our leaders? And what they came back with after 3 years of studying this was there were 5 key components. The first one, by far the most important one, was psychological safety. And I talked to Karen May, who at the time was the head of learning and development at Google and was one of the key people working for Google who was working on this study. And I asked her, I said, were you surprised by the findings? And she said, we weren't surprised that psychological safety was important, but we were surprised to find out how important it was. That basically, if a group has psychological safety, they've got a chance. If they don't, very, very, very difficult. Like, it's going to be a group of individuals just doing their thing, and hopefully they don't all piss each other off and drive each other crazy, but
Right.
they're not really going to be able to function as a team in a healthy and productive way. But if they have psychological safety, well, that's not the only thing they need. It's basically the most important and the foundational thing. And so if you think about that, for all of us, whatever types of teams we're a part of, the relationships we're in, the families that we're in, the work teams, however big or small, what it really takes to create more psychological safety with our team, with our group, is a willingness to be authentic and ultimately a willingness to be vulnerable with each other.
Yeah, that's why does that not surprise me? I mean, I always say vulnerability is the superpower, and it's something, it's like counterintuitive to what we've been taught up until this point, primarily as a society. And now all of a sudden people are saying, hold on here. When I'm vulnerable, I actually create connection with people. When I'm authentic, I actually create connection. And, in the past it was like, no, hide all that stuff, and so, so interesting.
And the paradox is, look, at some level, if we really break down vulnerability, physical vulnerability, we've all learned, understandably, how to protect ourselves physically based on our vulnerabilities. I mean, think of right now, right? We are all in this moment with the coronavirus staying at home because that makes us less vulnerable to either get the virus and or give it to others, right?
True.
So that's a practical thing. You and I get in our cars. What do? We put on our seatbelt, right? You look both ways before you cross the street, right? There's tons of things that we've done very practically, but also intuitively to know, like, I don't jump off the second story balcony in my house because I'm going to hurt myself, if not kill myself. Like, again, I mean, you touch the stove and right, when you're a kid and you burn your hand and it gets stored in your amygdala in your brain and says, don't do that again. So on a physical level, it is important to protect ourselves vulnerably. On an emotional level, it's tricky because, yes, we've all been hurt before. We've all had situations where we put ourselves out there and it didn't go well. The problem is, for what you were talking about, right? If we're going to create connection and trust with other human beings, we got to be willing to be vulnerable. And here's the other part. When you think about this from an innovation standpoint, from a creativity standpoint, you can't be innovative or creative. You can't try anything new or different if you're not willing to step into that vulnerable place.
Yeah.
Right. So many, we all talk about this, like procrastination, whether it's a writing project or something else. We're going, I'm putting it off. Why? Because we have to step into that. Oh man, this is going to suck, or I don't know how this is going to go, or the voice in my head is driving me crazy. Right. So I love the definition that Dr. Brene Brown at the University of Houston, who's become very well known in the last 5-10 years. She's amazing, right? In her work, she studies human emotions like shame and vulnerability and other aspects. And her TED talk on vulnerability that came out like 10 years ago went viral and is part of what, really catapulted her career and her work, and why many of us are familiar with her. And she defines vulnerability this way. And I love this definition, Brandon, because it's succinct and it's really clear. She says vulnerability is risk, emotional exposure, and uncertainty. Risk, emotional exposure, and uncertainty. Can you think of anything meaningful or important you've ever accomplished or experienced in your life, professionally or personally, that did not involve risk, emotional exposure, or uncertainty?
Right. Yeah.
No. Anything that matters. A relationship, a project, a job, a goal, a dream, you name it, a team, a group of people. If it matters to us, it's going to require one, two, or all three of those things. The problem is, we've learned a lot of strategies, consciously and unconsciously, how to not do that so as to protect ourselves. And specifically, look, we learn them for different reasons and at different levels and in different times. But like you and I as men, we've definitely got a bunch of training about how men are supposed to operate, right? Boys don't cry, suck it up, be a man. Right. And again, women get a whole other set of training in terms of how they're supposed to be or not be. But with respect to vulnerability, we've gotten direct and indirect messages throughout our lives about how not to do that. And now all of a sudden, over the last number of years, we're being encouraged and told, hey, it's important. You need to do this. And it's like, okay, but And maybe we do it personally. Maybe we do it with respect to our spiritual practice or different things, but in our family, maybe not. But do we do it at work, in our businesses? Hold on a second. I'm supposed to be a leader. I'm supposed to be an expert. I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about or whatever, right? So it's easy to think about on the surface, but as we dig into it, and I've been studying authenticity and vulnerability for a number of years, really to look out that there's a lot of depth and a lot of nuance, and it takes a real um, commitment and a lot of courage in order for us to operate that way.
Yeah, yeah, it really does, and I love that, you know, premise and notion that look, this is the path to anything that's meaningful, and
Yes.
so many people, you know, play it safe, and
Yep.
in really the biggest risk of all is playing it safe, right?
Totally. Well, and it's like I think of something, a mentor of mine said to me years ago. He said, Mike, when I was starting my business, actually, I was, here I'd been an athlete. I'd done some things where I'd, put myself out there and whatnot, but I was trying to start this business and speak and write. And I was terrified. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll be any good at this. And I don't know if I can make any money at this. And I don't know what, and he said to me, he said, Mike, you're living your life as though you're trying to survive it. And I said, yeah. So he said, you have to remember something really important. I said, what's that? He said, nobody ever has.
Wow.
And I was like, what are you talking about? He said, the mortality rate is holding strong at 100%. And it was like this moment, we have those moments in life where someone says something and it just hits us right between the eyes, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. He said, stop trying so hard to protect yourself. Stop trying so hard to not screw up, to not get hurt, to not fail. Like it's just not possible. And again, I don't mean to be flippant about it at all, but it's like even in the face of what's going on right now in the world, and as scary as it is, I think it's really important. Look, one of my personal spiritual practices for many years has been, and maybe it's because I've dealt with so much loss and grief in my life, having lost both of my parents and my sister
Wow.
and a few other really important people in my life, is I think for us to meditate on and really face our own mortality, our own death on a regular basis is super important. And we don't talk about, especially in our American culture. Are you kidding? It's like the last thing people want to talk about because it's pretty heavy. It's intense. It can seem morbid and negative, and it can induce a lot of fear, understandably. But it's like we're all walking around in some trance, like it's not going to happen, instead of just putting it sort of front and center. And the reality is it could happen. And when something happens, like, again, we've never faced anything like this pandemic, but people are getting sick and people are dying, and it's scary and it's upsetting and it's unnerving. And at the same time, like, we could get sick and die at any time. Now, is it more likely right now because this is going on? Sure. I imagine statistically,
Yeah.
but like, again, I don't want to walk around in my life paranoid all the time of getting sick and dying, but what would it be like if we brought that a little more front and center? And in the business or work context, what does sort of death look like in business? Well, the business could go under, or I could lose my everything, or I could get fired, or but I often say to people, like, again, you don't have to run away from that or be obsessed with that all the time. But one of the conversations I've been having with my own team, Brandon, over the last few weeks we've been going through this, is like, look, I don't know what's going on. I don't know where this is going. And there's a scenario in which this business could be done in 6 months or less or more. I don't know.
Yep.
It's not what I want. It's not what we're planning, but this was not on the plan at the beginning of the year. Now this thing has happened, which is disrupting the whole world and the economy. And like, we have to grapple with the fact that we don't know what this is going to mean and how this is going to play out. And actually, that's one way that we build more psychological safety with our teams and with the people we work with, is by telling the truth.
Yeah. Right. I think, that's something that's really worked to my advantage. It's like, I've always just, I've never been big on posturing, or
Yeah.
pretending like I have something together that I don't, or like, and I see so much of that, especially in the business world. I had a business partner in the past that his whole life was one big posturing, everything was calculated and manipulated, and, and it's like, I've always went the opposite direction. Okay, guys, here's the reality of the situation, and how do we deal with it? And I think that builds trust.
It
instead of
does.
having to read between the lines all the time once you see that someone is doing that, because ultimately it's all felt,
Yes.
and people think that it's clever to be inauthentic when really it's all you're only fool. All deception is an act of self-deception, I believe.
It it's true, and I think at some level, energetically, people pick up on who we're being as much or more than what we're saying.
Yes.
So, like, one of the things I've learned over the years in my work, right? So, like, I get up on stage to speak a lot, right? And I love doing it. It's one of my favorites. My form of creative expression more than anything, talking, even right now, having a conversation. But when I get up on stage, I really love it. I have a sense of joy and bliss personally. I love what I'm talking about, but I'm more than what I'm speaking about. To me, it's always about the connection with the human beings in the room. It's one of the things that actually is practically and very specifically challenging for me at times. Like now, I'm giving presentations virtually, which is what's necessary. But it's like I'm looking at a computer screen. I'm not actually with humans, right?
Right.
But one of the things that I've learned over the years is that, yeah, sometimes I have some slides or sometimes I have a little outline of what I want to talk about, and all that's important. But like for me, if I'm there to talk about authenticity to a group of human beings, like my first job is to be authentic.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's
Right.
like, I mean, if I'm there to talk about appreciation, which is my first job is to be appreciative, come from a place of gratitude and appreciation as I'm talking about and attempting to teach or inspire. It's like, and I'm not saying that I or you or any of us have to be perfect, right? I mean, I can, look, being positive, and being positive doesn't mean that you're always in a good mood.
Right.
Being positive doesn't mean you're like, hey, rah rah, everything's awesome. That's fake, right? That's
Yep.
like, you and I live in California. That's everyone's like, hey man, everything's awesome. It's like,
All
yeah,
good.
everything's not actually awesome all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the first book that I wrote, Brandon, is called Focus on the Good Stuff. It's not called Everything's Good.
Right.
Because one of the things that I learned and what I wrote about in that book was like focusing on the good stuff, tapping into the power of appreciation and gratitude is actually deep spiritual work. And it's not easy to do because the world we live in, there's a ton of negativity and complaints coming at us. And the truth is, there's a lot of difficult things that we have to deal with as human beings. My friend Robert Holden, who's a psychologist, likes to say by the time you get to 30 years old, most of us have enough reasons to be miserable for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And basically what he's saying is like, it's a choice.
Yep.
It's a choice to show up every day and in our lives and choose. I'm going to choose to be grateful. I'm going to choose to grow. I'm going to choose to learn. I'm going to choose to find the lesson in this, right? I had a therapist years ago when I was going through a really hard time say to me, Mike, don't waste a good crisis. She was basically
Right.
saying, like, you're going through hell right now. It's really painful. Of course, you want to get through it and just survive, but pay attention because you can learn a ton in this time, even though it doesn't feel good and you really want to be on the other side of it. So, all of those things that were sort of, with respect to this first pillar in the book of psychological safety, it's like creating enough space for people to be human is a really important part. And especially again, right now, when people get stressed out or people are worried, one of the best things we can do to for the people we love, for the people we work with, is just give them space to be where they are without trying to fix it or change it. The second pillar of the four in the book is to focus on inclusion and belonging.
Mm.
And I decided, Brandon, that I wanted to really dive. This was like, of the four pillars, this piece is probably the newest of my work that I've sort of put out. The other three pillars were sort of deeper understandings of stuff that I've talked about or looked at, I researched and sort of framed differently. This one felt new and important and a little scary, quite frankly, to me, because so much has happened in our country and in our world in the last few years with respect to issues of diversity and inclusion, with respect to kind of a lot of cultural and political conversations and a lot of disconnection and separation, and
Right.
what's been happening in the business world, but just in our culture as a whole. And I think social media has really driven this. Is that on the one hand, we're talking about so many more things, which is great. We're bringing so many more issues to the forefront. Movements like Me Too or Black Lives Matter, or things putting stuff in the consciousness. Like, oh my gosh, these things are happening, and those of us who may not be part of certain groups are not. Oh my, is that really happening to people? What
Right.
And at the same time, people go into their little silos and their little echo chambers, and everyone starts yelling and tweeting, and it's like, oh my goodness, these conversations are super important and really hard to have. And within teams, and groups, what we know, what research tells us, and we're seeing now, the data shows, is that the more diverse a team is, a group is, the more successful and effective they can be, because it brings different perspectives and different ideas and different skills. And that diversity is, yes, it's racial and it's ethnic and it's gender and it's orientation and it's age and background and all those things, but it's also just a diversity of thought, a diversity of skill, a diversity of, way of operating, if you will. But again, it can be difficult to pay attention to and to address effectively. And what I started to realize, so I'm someone who, I grew up in Oakland, California,
Mm-hmm.
white, straight, male, um, you know, but what was interesting from my early years, right away, Oakland's incredibly racially diverse. And as I moved through going through public schools, by the time I got to middle school and high school, I was a minority, not a minority in the culture, but a minority in my schools, a minority in my social circle, a minority on all my teams. I was like often my junior year in high school, I played basketball in addition to baseball. I was the only white kid, not only on the team, but in the entire league.
Wow.
Every single other player in the league was African American, and one white boy on the one of the 6 high schools in Oakland was me, right? And so it
Wow.
was like, whoa, that was a pretty intense experience for me to have. And I was super aware of it at the time, although I didn't fully understand the context of it. It wasn't until I went to college, I go to Stanford, and then it was like, oh my goodness, this was not like Oakland, even though it's like 45 minutes from Oakland down in Palo Alto. My friends would call me from home and say, what's it like at Stanford? And I'd say, well, it's interesting. It's pretty cool. It's definitely different. I've never been around this many white people in my life.
Right.
And that was my honest reaction from, and I felt like, oh, I didn't even know there were a bunch of cultural and social norm things that most of these other kids who looked just like me, I didn't understand.
Mm.
We didn't listen to the same music. We didn't dress the same. We didn't talk the same, because I had grown up in a very different environment. And so I share all that because I've been someone who's been super interested in and aware of issues with respect to race. And I grew up, I was raised by a single mom with an older sister. My mom was really, really passionate feminist. Women like Gloria Steinem and Billie Jean King, and, were talked about in my house with reverence.
Right.
My mom took me out of school when I was 10 years old, when Geraldine Ferraro came in 1984 to speak in front of Oakland City Hall when she was running for vice president. And it was like a huge deal. My mom was like, you're going to come and see this woman because this is a big deal. This is history. And I want you to see this. So that was my mindset, if you will. And then I get out into the world and I'm just like this white guy, right? And I'm looking around, and even when I started my business 20 years ago, I wanted to talk about diversity, but I was scared. And I'm like, well, who wants to listen to a young straight white dude talk about this? What do I know? And who's going to take me seriously? And there's all these experts in this field who have way more lived experience of what it's like to be female or be a person of color. Anyway, I share all of that as backdrop to, it hasn't been up until the last couple years where I've started to go, oh, wait a minute. We all have an important voice in this conversation. And if people who look like me aren't willing to engage, or either don't pay attention and or don't feel comfortable engaging, we've got a problem,
Right.
a bigger problem in terms of how do we address it. So part of why I say all that, again, it wasn't about making a political statement. It was more about, as teams and as leaders and as people, are we willing to be open and vulnerable to really engage in some of these deeper level conversations that need to happen? And if we do, what's the benefit? And there's huge benefit for our teams, because ultimately what I found as I started to research more of this, like, oh, we talk about diversity, which is representation. We talk about inclusion, which is making sure people feel included. But what the interesting thing about inclusion is, when we focus primarily on inclusion, what we're saying is there's a dominant group, there's an in group, and then there's a bunch of out groups. And while that is true, and we want to include the people who are in any of those out groups in the in group, whatever that means, there still sets up this dynamic of power structure that, like, hey, why don't you come on board and we're going to make you feel more included than excluded, which is great. However, as I was interviewing a lot of people who aren't from sort of dominant majority groups, what I heard was, hey, I'd rather be included than excluded, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd actually most likely just like to know that I belong.
Mm.
And belonging to me really resonated. And I started to look at, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's physiological needs at the base. There's safety needs. Then the third level on Maslow's hierarchy of 5 is belonging.
Mm.
We have a fundamental human need to belong. It's not simply just for some people or certain people or this person or that. It's for all of us. We've all had experiences of belonging, and we've all had experiences of not belonging.
For sure.
So again, if you think about this in terms of your family, you think about it in terms of your team, the group of people, a community, even a community online or whatever, Do we create a sense of belonging? Do people feel like they belong, like there's ownership, like, hey, again, we're all in this together? And so it's a fundamental thing that great teams do. If you think of any team or group you've ever been a part of where it really worked, if you trace it back, you realize, I would imagine you and probably just about everybody else on that team or in that group felt a genuine sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And
Right.
looking at ways that we can do that and be mindful of certain things so that we are including people versus excluding people, but ultimately getting to a place where everyone on the team and everyone in the group feels like they belong, they have a voice. And look, and sometimes in the way it works in the world, in a business, right? If you run a business, like you launching this show, I mean, there's someone's in charge,
Yep.
right? And so you can have a role and there's a hierarchy to things. Like, I'm in charge with my team as well, but I'm constantly paying attention to, not only am I including people's ideas and voices in the team, but do people feel a real sense of ownership and like they belong? Even if in a practical sense, I'm the owner of the business, the other people I'm paying, they don't actually own the business, they're employees of the business, but they still can belong.
Yeah. Before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our new sponsor, BetterHelp. As you know, we do everything we possibly can on the show to help people shift their perspectives to help them lead a healthy and happy life. That being said, sometimes we really just need someone to talk to directly that can help us navigate whatever challenge we're going through at that time. And if you're at that point in your life currently, BetterHelp makes this process super convenient by connecting you with a professional counselor in a safe and private environment, either on video, phone, or via text chats. BetterHelp has licensed therapists that specialize in almost any scenario you may be struggling with, such as depression, anxiety, grief, trauma, or relationship issues. And if you don't like the counselor you get assigned for any reason, you can request a new one at any time. Best of all, not only is it a convenient option, it's also affordable. And if you use the code POSITIVEHEAD, it's even more affordable because you get 10% off your first month. So if you're hearing this and you get the feeling that one of BetterHelp's 3,000 licensed therapists could help get you to where you want and deserve to be mentally, head over to betterhelp.com/positivehead and be sure to use the discount code POSITIVEHEAD, all one word, to get 10% off your first month. Yeah, and I think it's really important as a leader to realize the most powerful thing you can do is serve those that are
Yes.
are working for you in the sense where you're the owner and they're the employee. It's like, how do you help
Absolutely.
remove obstacles? How do you serve? Not sit on some throne far removed from
Yes.
everyone and kind of look down your nose. That's like
Right.
the difference between like a true leader and a boss, I would say, right?
Totally. Well, and I think it's also trying as best we can to understand that people are different, and I'm never going to know, even if you and I look the same and we have the same background and we grew up in the same place and we're the same age, and I mean I'm never going to know exactly what your experience is because you're you and I'm me,
Yep.
right? So is that separation. However, we do have an ability, even and especially when people are really different than we are, to understand and have empathy about their experience. And sometimes I think it's important for us to be humbled by and listen to. There's a story that I share in the book about my wife, Michelle, and I going to a workshop. This was a couple of years
Mm-hmm.
ago. And again, I told my story, right? Like, I'm somebody, I mean, Michelle and I have been together for almost 20 years now. We have 2 daughters. I was raised by a single mom, older sister. Like, I've literally been around females in my home. Most of my entire life has had an enormous amount of female and feminine influence. I consider myself someone who, pays attention to gender equity and to that, right? So we're in this workshop, and the woman leading the workshop says, okay, I'm going to ask the men a question, and then I'm going to ask the women a question, the same question, but just I want you to answer separately. She said, I'd like to ask you to think about a time, the last time you could remember feeling physically unsafe. When do you remember feeling physically unsafe? I'm going to give you some time frames. I want you to raise your hand just once, and the time frame that represents when you can remember. Was it within the last 10 years? Was it within the last 5 years? Was it within, and she goes, 1 year, 6 months. She goes all the way on 3 months, a month, a week, the last 24 hours. And like, and all the guys in the room, they're raising their hands at different times. I think I raised my hand at, like, within the last year, remembering a time I was on a business trip in Washington, D.C. and had went out late and got lost coming back to my hotel, and was like, I was scared. I didn't know where I was, and I didn't feel safe. Like, I need to get back to the hotel. Anyway, she asks the women the same question. And as she's saying 10 years, 5 years, a year, so none of the women are raising their hands. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And then she gets to within a week, and about, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20% of the hands in the room go up. She says, within the last 24 hours, and the vast majority of the women in the room, including my wife sitting right next to me, raised their hands.
Right.
That they had felt physically unsafe in the last 24 hours. And I look at Michelle like,
Yep.
what? And I look around the room at all the women like, what? And most of the men, we're all looking at each other like, what is going on? How is this possible? And the women are all looking at us like,
you don't know? Yeah,
know?
Right.
And then the woman leading the workshop says, this is one of the fundamental differences between walking around in the world in a female body versus walking around in a male body. And we hardly ever even talk about it. It's just part of our lived experience. And again, she wasn't saying it to shame us but it was really this like, I mean, and I felt moved to tears in a way with this empathy for, oh my gosh, like, of course I know it's different for women than it is for men. Of course, I think about in a lot of ways the ways that women have to operate but that was something like so basic and so fundamental that I'm like, I don't even think about that.
Yeah.
And again, so I say that can we, all of us as human beings, try to have empathy and understanding for what other people's experiences are like, not compare our experiences, not say my experience is better or worse than yours. Then we go down a rabbit hole, which can be really dangerous. Comparative suffering, as a lot of us are paying attention to right now. If you're at home in the midst of all of this, feeling bad that, oh, I'm disappointed I don't get to do this, or I feel bad my business was going great and now we're hitting a bump, or I don't know when I'm going to get to go on that trip, and then you feel, oh, it's terrible, people are sick and dying, and we can get into a whole, like, our experience is our experience. So like your pain, whatever it is real, just like mine is. It doesn't serve us to sort of, and we can still also have perspective, that sometimes I can be stressed out and then have some perspective that like, oh, like our parents taught us when we were kids, even though we rolled our eyes, like, there's people in the world that don't have any food, quit complaining about your dinner. You know what I mean? Because that was true, although they were shaming us in that moment, which is part of why it didn't resonate. It was true though. Like, yeah, I get that you don't like the way that I make the mashed potatoes, but like, get over yourself, because there's people who would love to have this meal because they don't have a meal.
Right.
And again, both things can be true at the same time. And I think with respect to inclusion and belonging, a lot of it is just paying more attention and being more open.
Yeah. I remember Tony Robbins doing that same exercise when I was at a Tony Robbins event, and being
really?
And being just floored by that as well. It's like that. Oh my goodness! Wow. I guess I understand this now that I think about it, but I've never really thought about this, and how dramatically different it is, that particular perspective, between men and women.
Well, and again, and if we can appreciate it, I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, so I was a senior in high school when the Rodney King riots happened in Los Angeles, where you live now.
Me too.
And I was up in Oakland, right? And I remember that whole experience and seeing the tape of Rodney King and the whole trial, and then the police officers got acquitted and people went crazy, right? And the riots happened and it was really sad and it was awful and there was a loss of life and there was all that happened, right? But trying to understand that and being friends with, having so many African-American friends who I was really close with. And right after the Rodney King thing, I remember feeling this animosity, this sense of tension that was another level of, and looking at my really good friends, my Black friends, who were looking at me in this way with this anger and this disdain. And I was like, and it was scary. And talking to a couple friends of mine, I'm like, I don't understand what's going on. Like, I'm really angry that this happened. I don't understand. This seems like it's unfair and unjust, but like, why are you mad at me?
Right.
And it was like, I'm not mad. And my friend Sean said, I'm not mad at you, Mike, but you don't understand what I'm feeling right now in the same way that I'm feeling it. And I said, well, yes, I do. I was trying to, yes, I do. I'm angry. This is wrong. And no, he said to me, he said, Mike, what did your parents teach you about the police when you were growing up? I said, what do you mean? He said, what did you learn about the cops? And I was like, I don't know. Like, don't get in trouble and like listen to the cops. And like, he's like, yeah, that's not what I learned. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, that's not what my parents taught me. My parents taught me, look, there's some good police and there's some bad police, and you don't always know the difference. So you got to be careful with police, because some terrible things have happened to people in our community from the police. So they're not always the good guys. And I was, in that moment, it was similar to the like, oh, men and women have a different experience. Like, as a white person in America, for the most part, I, at 17 or 18 years old, however old I was, I thought of the cops mostly as the good
Right.
guys. You know, there's a bad cop here or there, but like, if you grew up in an African American community in a place like Oakland, California, you probably had a very different lived experience of your interactions with the police. And I'm not saying this to bash the police per se, but
Yep.
like, you and I can imagine, right? So again, can we have more empathy and understanding for, like, not everybody experiences the world the same way we experience the world, and to be have enough humility. This really comes up so much in the way that we work, because the thing is, like, as open-minded as I try to be, Brandon, I am like all of us, I am limited to my
Yep.
own experience and perspective. And so, you know, inclusion and belonging is about all of us continuing to open our mind and open our hearts and open our experience to the experiences that other people have that may be different than ours, and to try to have as much empathy as we possibly can. We don't have to walk around apologizing for ourselves or feeling bad about our experience. We just have to own, this is my experience. And the other thing too that I talk about in the book is privilege, and that privilege gets used often as this almost slur these days. It's like, you're privileged. It's like, well, we're all privileged to some degree. Some of us are more privileged than others, but understanding and owning privilege is actually a really important part of creating a strong team and a strong
Yeah.
community.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think the more we can try and put ourselves, in the other person's shoes, and not be always hearing the other perspective with curiosity. And it's so
Yes.
easy to say, no, this is how it works. This is how my life has been. And so therefore that's how it is. And
Right.
it really is a requirement that we continue to listen with an open heart and mind to other people's perspectives.
Absolutely. And you're right. Curiosity is
Yeah.
the key, because that actually leads into the third pillar, which is what I call embrace sweaty palm conversations. So another mentor of mine, I've been fortunate to have a lot of great mentors in my life, said this thing to me many years ago. He said, Mike, you know what stands between you and the kind of relationships you really want to have with people? I said, what's that? He said, it's probably a 10-minute sweaty palm conversation you're too afraid to
Wow.
have. I said, what? He said, if you get good at those 10-minute sweaty palm conversations, you'll have fantastic relationships. You'll build trust, you'll resolve conflicts, you'll give feedback, you'll get feedback, you'll talk about the elephant in the room, you'll make requests, you'll just bring stuff up and talk about things sooner rather than later. He said, if you do like most of us and you avoid them because they can be a little awkward or uncomfortable, or they get a little messy, or people sometimes get upset or get their feelings hurt or don't always like what you have to say, or he's like, then you end up being a victim of who you live with and who you work with.
Right.
And that, look, here's the thing. I don't love those conversations. I don't know anybody who really enjoys having them. They're just necessary all the time, especially, by the way, when things are stressful. Like, I've had a ton of sweaty palm conversations with my team, with my wife, with friends, with people in the last few weeks, because it's like, ooh, the world has been flipped upside down in so many ways. But again, they oftentimes, and as I talk about them in the book, it's about resolving conflict, and it's also about giving and receiving feedback. I mean, what we were just talking about before, if we can have conversations and really listen to each other with respect to issues of diversity and inclusion and belonging, like, those are really sweaty palm
Right.
conversations. But sometimes it's like asking for what we want, or sometimes it's about addressing something that didn't quite work or didn't sit right with us. I mean, we've all had it happen where something happens, it kind of bothers us, but we're like, I don't want to make a big deal about it or whatever. And then we don't say anything. And then it just escalates and escalates and escalates over days or weeks or months. And finally, right, I come to you and go, Brandon,
Yep.
blah,
Yep.
and you're like, what is going
Yep.
on? And it's because there was one thing that started it, but then a bunch of things that I didn't say. And when I finally said it, you got like 3 months worth of my resentment that I wasn't speaking up
Right.
about. And then you react to it. And then we get in this big fight, and then things are a problem. But it was like, oh, if I had dealt with this like 3 months ago when I first felt that little ping in my belly that went, oh, that didn't quite sit right with me,
Yep.
then you know what I mean? And so the thing is, so for a team, again, back to the psychological safety, if you create that as a norm, as you create that as, here's how we operate as a team. Are these things uncomfortable? Yes. Do we love having conflict or giving feedback or receiving? No, we don't all love it. It's like not the funnest thing. It's just
Yep.
necessary. And there's an exercise that I love that I use with my wife, I with my team, with teams I work with, but it's really simple, but I think it's super effective, and it's a way to elicit feedback. Because one of the things we know about feedback, most of us don't love receiving feedback or giving it because it's not that easy. But if I come to you and I say, Brandon, I have some feedback for you, that's going to elicit a certain response, a visceral response, right? That's going to make you more defensive, even if we have a good relationship, or maybe I'm your manager, boss, whatever. That's part of my job. But if I come to you and say, hey, Brandon, do you have any feedback for me? That changes the dynamic. Then I'm letting you know I'm open to your feedback. I'm giving you an invitation. It still might be a bit of a sweaty palm conversation, but a great way to start a conversation like that, to get feedback, and then to get feedback flowing back and forth or amongst the team, is these 3 really simple words and questions. But it's like this: what could I start doing that I'm not doing that you think would have me be more successful, or have our relationship be more effective? So it's start. What could I start doing? What could I stop doing that I'm currently doing that's getting in the way of my success or us, really having a great, wonderful, harmonious, effective relationship? And what could I continue doing? So it's start, stop, continue. And the thing is, if I come to you and ask you that, and I'm really open to hearing what you have to say, first of all, I don't have to do everything you tell me to start and stop and continue, but at least I'm getting your perspective. And I'm making it relatively easy. And if we set that up, that we're going to have that conversation back and forth, start, stop, continue. I ask you, you ask me. We do that as a team. What it does is it kind of demystifies and takes some of the taboo and the hardest part of sweaty palm conversations usually is like literally the first 10 seconds, 20 seconds is starting it. Oh my God, I have this really. So I often also advocate and try to do this myself. Start a sweaty palm conversation by telling the truth, which my version of that is usually, oh my God, I really don't want to have this conversation. Like I've been putting it off, or I've been scared, or I'm worried you're going to get upset, or this is going to go bad. Not to then like sort of emotionally vomit all over the person, but to let them know authentically, here's where I'm coming from.
Right.
As opposed to coming in hot and like, we'll let you get, I've rehearsed my opening line, so I'm going to really come at you. And it's like, well, usually that's off the rails right away.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. That's such great advice, because when you are willing to receive someone's feedback, people want to be heard more than anything, and when you say, hey, I'm open to your feedback. I want to hear your feedback. Now, it instantly, they feel heard, they feel respected, and it instantly opens them to it coming the other direction. So, being the instigator of that is what a powerful piece of advice for anyone who wants to lead.
Well, and taking that growth mindset approach, there's someone on TV in the news media who I have a lot of respect for in so many ways, but there's one specific thing that she does that I think is extraordinary. It's Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. And she's, first of all, super smart. And whether you watch her or not, there's this thing that she does. She will bring guests on all the time, often experts in whatever she's talking about. And she does her show in kind of a unique way. She does these long segments where she kind of does these deep dives into really unpacking some complex issues, which I appreciate because like I learn when I'm watching her. But she'll explain something like right now with all that's happening with the coronavirus, she's talking about both technology and aspects of epidemiology. And she'll be the first to admit, like, I'm not an expert in this, but let me explain to you the way I understand it. She'll explain the whole thing. And let's say I'm her and you're the guest, right? I'm Rachel Maddow. I'm explaining all this. Then I'd bring you on and say, Brandon, thank you for joining us. I've introduced you, whatever. Can you start first by telling me, did I get any of that wrong? Or is there something else to add to that? So that, she basically says like, tell me what I just screwed up because I don't really know what I'm talking about. I was just trying to explain this to the audience in a way they would understand. Right. And more often than not, the guest says, no, you actually did a really good job of encapsulating what that is. Or they say, oh, I would add this piece. But there's this way in which here's this person on television who's smart, who makes a lot of money, who's very well known, who I'm assuming has an ego like the rest of us. But she just says, I don't care if you correct me on national television. I'm more committed to the audience getting the right information and knowing what they need to know than I am in sounding smart. And to me, like now she's a TV person, a news person. Most of us aren't ever going to be in that role. But to me, that's a great example of leadership because it's like, hey, I'm going to defer to the people around me. And as you were talking about, be in service of them and the audience, the people I'm serving, not so much have to be the smartest person in the room.
Right. Love that.
Yeah. And then the fourth and final pillar is care about and challenge each other. And I had a chance to interview one of my favorite people in the world, Brandon, on my own podcast about 6 months ago. His name's Dean Stotts, and he was my pitching coach at Stanford. and has at the time was, great coach and mentor. Has we've stayed close. He's continued to be a friend and a mentor, and our families are close. And Dean is retired now. He's about 20 years older than I am, but he coached at Stanford for 37 years. Had a ton of success there. Really, really smart, interesting guy. I mean, we're very different philosophically, very different political views. Like we've always had kind of this banter and debate over the years, but I love this man. I respect and admire this man. It's a really beautiful relationship in my life. And he said something when I had him on the podcast that epitomizes what this pillar is about. He said, Mike, my philosophy in coaching for 37 years at Stanford was this: with my players, I got to love them hard so I can push them hard.
Wow.
And I said, what do you mean, Dean? He said, I knew when I was coaching you and all of your teammates and all the guys that came before you and all the guys that came after you, if I was going to push you personally and the team collectively so that you could perform at the absolute highest level, the first thing I had to do was make sure that you knew that I cared about you as a person.
Right. Wow.
And if you felt that, if you knew that I cared about you, that I loved you, that I had your back, then you would give me permission to push you. But if I didn't do that up front and continue to nurture the relationship, I wasn't going to be able to push you.
Wow.
And when he said that, I was like, Dean, that's what a great leader does. That's what a great team does. Like, you create that kind of environment where we can push each other. But first and foremost, we have to constantly care about each other and keep nurturing our relationships with each other. Because again, like, I can get feedback, back to the feedback thing. I can get feedback from two people, the exact same feedback. I could need this feedback. It could be super valuable. This is going to help me grow, be deeper, be more effective at what I'm doing, be more open, be more spiritually aligned, and whatever. I'm going to take the feedback based on one primary condition. What's the nature of my relationship with that person who's giving me the feedback?
Right.
If I know they care about, if I, like Brandon, let's say I know you care about me, you got my back, you're right, I'll listen to the feedback. If some other person I don't know, or I think maybe this person thinks I'm an idiot, or we don't have much of a relationship, or it feels like they're judging me, whatever, I'm going to be much more defensive, even though the feedback might be just as valuable and they might have real wisdom and insight.
Right. That makes so much sense. That's such a solid, solid piece of advice and perspective to really wrap your brain around, wrap your heart around, right?
Yeah. And think about the work that you do, and think about the focus of this show too. Like, when you really think about doing deep spiritual work, looking at sort of the consciousness, looking at sort of how we show up in life in all these places, most of us, and I imagine most people listening, we're seeking, right? We're seeking. We want to learn. We want to grow. We want to connect. We want to expand. And in that seeking, whether we find ourselves as the teacher or the student or both, which we usually are a bit of both,
Yep.
right? This is what I always think about, even in my own teaching, is that, again, first and foremost, I was saying earlier, my job is to try to embody that which I'm teaching, not be perfect, but come from that place. But also, if I'm going to impact any other human being's life, whether it's in a one-on-one situation, a conversation, whether it's in a group situation where I'm leading a workshop or teaching or some kind of retreat, or whether I'm speaking to a large group, or I'm even on this podcast talking to you and people are listening to us wherever, what I'm attempting to do in my own teaching, first and foremost, is try to connect with the other human being or human beings there from a place of, even if I don't know you personally, I actually care about you and value you. That's why I'm saying and doing what I'm saying and doing. And I think sometimes what can happen for those of us, any of us who find ourselves in a teaching role of any kind, or wanting to inspire or impact other people, is, again, our egos can take over and we get really caught up in, I'm so great and I'm so smart and I'm so wise and I'm so deep, or whatever. And again, not that it's not about honoring and owning our strength or our power, but it's also having the humility to realize people will listen to us and be open to whatever it is we want to share with them if we first and foremost connect with them
Yep.
on a bit of a human and heart level.
Agreed. I always say, humility is the key word as we all, grow. And another thing that I'm fond of saying, the listeners have heard me say many, many times, is we teach best what we most need to learn.
Oh, so, yeah. For sure. Well, for sure. I mean, I used to have a joke back and forth with a friend of mine who does the same kind of work. I would say to him, hey, man, take my advice. I'm not using it.
I like that. That's so good. You can have it.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think a lot of times, to that point, though, I think we have a lot of insight and perspective into what we want to teach based on some of the things that we struggle with. So all the things in all of my books and all the things that I've taught for years, I'm drawn to those things because yes, there's some passion and some interest, but also usually there's some pain and some challenge for me in those things, and wanting to learn them more then has me want to turn around and teach them, but not from a place of some holier than thou. Well, I have this all handled and figured out. Let me impart my wisdom upon you so that you can figure it out, because I also don't think in today's world that really resonates with
Yeah.
people. And usually it's not true.
Right. Right. Wow, so much goodness here, Mike. I so have enjoyed this, and one of the thing is, as we sort of wind down here, if you have a story up your sleeve, listeners know I love to hear a good story of synchronicity or serendipity or positive paranormal
Yeah.
story. Any even if you have something like that, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah. As you just said that, one popped into my mind, and it's, so when my baseball career ended, I read a book. I was reading a book at the time, sort of as it was coming to an end, and it happened to coincide. I read a book. This was 1998. I read a book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and it's all small stuff.
Yeah, I've heard of this book.
Beautiful book. It was the number one selling book in America 2 years in a row in 97, 98. And it was written by a man named Richard Carlson, a psychologist who actually lived in the Bay Area. I found out after I read the book. And I read this book, and I kept thinking as I was reading this book, it was really helping me at the time. And I was in this place where I knew my career was coming to an end, and I was in a lot of pain physically and mentally, emotionally. But I drove back across country from Florida, where I had been at spring training with the Kansas City Royals, where I got released. And I kept thinking this thing, Brandon, I need to reach out to Richard Carlson. And I'm like, why am I thinking that? That's weird. I don't know this man. I just read his book. I'm sure he's busy, right? Reach out to Richard, reach out to Richard. Okay, fine. I'm like getting this message from the universe. Okay. So I get home. I write him a letter. This was 98, right? He had a PO box. He had a PO box address in the back of his book, and I write this letter and I send it in the mail. I get a letter back from his assistant or someone who works on his team. Thank you so much. Richard's really busy, and it's kind of like, then there's a form letter. Here's some resources if you want to connect. And it was actually really heartfelt. It wasn't just like, here, buy more stuff from me. It was like, and I appreciated it, but it was like, I hope he got my letter. I hope he read it. I really want him to get it. I got onto his website. I didn't even have my own computer at the time. I was literally at like the Stanford library looking for jobs. A few weeks later, I find his website. He had a message board. I post a note on the message board, basically just saying, hey, I wrote you this letter. My letter was basically like, I loved your book. It really inspired me. Thank you so much. I really would love to do this kind of work at some point in my life. I don't know how you go about doing it, but anyway, that was basically the letter. I didn't want specific. Anyway, I write this thing on his website. I get a letter in the mail 3 days later that's like a 2-page letter from Richard Carlson, super heartfelt.
Wow.
Really, hey, I read your thing on my website. Thank you so much. And I am really busy with my work and my family, but here's a few things I can offer, and it was a sign. I said, this is a sign I'm supposed to do this. This is the spring of 1998. Fast forward almost 5 years. It's 2003. I'm with my wife. We weren't married yet at the time, Michelle. We're at a fundraising event, and Richard Carlson is one of the people speaking at this event for this nonprofit. I'm like, oh my God, babe, Richard Carlson's here. I had started my business. I'd done the .com thing for a couple of years. I'd started my business. I was coaching. I had an idea to want to write a book on appreciation, which turned into my book, Focus on the Good Stuff, that came out a few years later. But I say to Michelle, I got to go say hi to Richard after. I was super nervous. I go up to him. Hey, Richard, you probably don't remember this. It was many years ago. I wrote you this thing, but he's like, I remember your letter.
Wow.
I said, really? He said, yeah. And then we start talking, and I was like trying not to bug him, but, and it comes up in the conversation that I want to write this book on appreciation. He says, the world could use a book on appreciation. Let me know if I can help you out. And he hands me his card, and I'm like, are you kidding? This is like, and I follow up with him. We end up going out to coffee. We spend 3 hours at coffee. We just magically have this connection. Like, he feels like a big brother. He says, I want to help you. I want to mentor you. What can I do? He offers to write the foreword for my book. He offers to help find me a literary. I mean, he's just offering these things to me that I would never have asked, but he's just offering. I end up writing my book, Focus on the Good Stuff, and I get done with it in the fall of 2006. Richard writes the foreword for the book.
Wow.
And 3 weeks later, he very suddenly and very sadly dies.
Wow. Oh, man.
At 45 years old, he had a pulmonary embolism sitting on an airplane flying to New York City to do a media appearance for the book that he had just written. Super sad, super
Wow.
tragic. Like,
So young.
that so young family. I mean, but I share all of this because there was something, and to this day, I am sitting in my office, sitting at Richard's old desk that his wife Chris gave to me after he passed
Wow.
away, having this conversation with you today. And the whole time we've been talking, Richard's been like in my ear in a really good
Wow.
way, as he often is, talking to me and reminding me of things, as he does and has for the last 13 and a half years since he's been on the other side. And one of the things that I tap into a lot in my work, I don't talk about this out loud because sometimes it freaks people out all the time. But I shared, you and I were talking a little bit before, and knowing your show and your audience, it's like I tap into a lot of things that are happening metaphysically that I can't see. People like Richard and others who've passed away who still communicate with me in a way that I try to remind myself that I'm not alone and I'm in it together, not just with the people in my life and the people that I work with and the people that I know, but so many others, other entities, other beings, and others on the other side. So
Wow.
I just felt moved to share that as we wrap
Wow, I
this up.
love that you shared that because especially, your teachings, your writings, your sort of approach dealing with these, big companies and Forbes and these kinds of things. It's like that's
Yes.
oftentimes far removed from this realm. And I love,
Yes.
love, love when I see someone who actually is bridging and is giving the respect due to these, these this more expanded view of reality
Yes.
and is acknowledging that, hey, look, people continue to exist beyond physical and we can actually tap in. And I know you had mentioned to me before we started that you even, go to a channel that is sort of a counselor.
Yes.
And I just love
Yeah.
it when I see someone like yourself, because myself as well, I've sort of bridged both, traditional business world and, a world of metaphysical teachings
Yeah.
and so forth. And it's certainly spent more time in the metaphysical realm in recent years. But,
Right.
I feel like the world needs a lot more of people who are sort of helping to the rest of the world to see, like, look, this is not just nonsense. This is real.
Right. Well, and I would say a couple things on that. I know we're just wrapping up, but I think one thing though that I've learned over the years, or a couple things I've learned, is on the one hand, I do think it's important to be mindful and respectful of the
Where they're
people
at.
that you're with and where people are. And again, not to be holier than thou, or, oh, I'm so deep, I couldn't tell you all this deep metaphysical stuff because it would freak you out because I'm so much more spiritual
Right.
than you. Like, that's an ego
Yep.
trip. However, sometimes stuff will freak people out in a way that will shut them down, and not so much, yeah, it's uncomfortable because they think we're weird, but now we've lost the connection with
Yep.
them. And I believe that a lot of us, if we are spiritually and metaphysically tapped in, one of the responsibilities we can take on, we don't have to, but we can choose to, and I've chosen this path, is to go out into the world in a quote unquote sort of mainstreamed way, and without being disrespectful or without dumbing it down or without thinking I'm better than anybody. How do I communicate a lot of this really deep spiritual metaphysical wisdom that I've learned and I believe in and tap into in a way that actually can benefit people?
Yeah.
And that's not that easy to do, quite frankly, but it's necessary. And the world needs it now more than ever before. And yeah, it's a little scary and it's a little uncomfortable. And every now and again, people will roll their eyes at you and think you're
Yep.
weird and make fun of you. But you know what? You'll be okay. And if we just hang out in our own little echo chamber where we know everyone agrees with us and thinks we're okay and doesn't think we're weird, that's fine. But that's not where the real work is and where the real
Yep.
growth is and where we can really make a
Yep.
difference.
I love that. You're absolutely right. It's like if you blow everyone out of the water by, going super, super 5D on them,
Yeah.
you're not really helping anyone. And it's important to know your audience, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, this has been so, so cool, Mike. You are such an inspiration, my friend. What is the best way for people who want to continue to follow your work to do so? And where can they get the book? And I'm assuming all the places, right?
Yeah, all the places, wherever you get books. We actually set up a special page, and this is probably the best place for people to go to connect with me, but also the book. It's Mike-Robbins/together.
Cool.
And there's some cool stuff on that page and some other stuff people get when they order the book now. But just go to Mike-Robbins.com/together.
Got it. Got it. Well, I do have one final question here for you,
Yes.
and it is this. In 60 seconds or less, what is the meaning of life according to Mike Robbins?
Oh,
A little cliche for you there here at the end.
yeah. I think the meaning of life is love, loving ourselves, loving the people around us, loving the world as courageously and passionately as we can.
Beautiful, beautifully said, beautifully delivered. Mike, thank you so much for being and taking the time to connect here today. All of you out there listening, so appreciate you all. Hope you are having a magical moment wherever you're receiving this message. Until next time, journey well. Love you all so much. And if you're feeling the call to come for a week retreat style Mystic Manor immersion, remember to go now and book your time to speak with me directly about stepping into the optimistic vortex at calendly.com/talk with Brandon while there are still spots left. Otherwise, I look forward to co-creating magic with you at the Mystic Manor.